You open the fridge and something smells off. Maybe it's milk that's turned sour. Maybe it's meat that's developed that unmistakable rotten smell. Maybe it's a forgotten bag of salad or a piece of fruit covered in fuzzy mold. We all know what spoiled food looks like, and we all know what it smells like. But here's something strange. Spoiled milk doesn't smell anything like spoiled meat. Rancid cooking oil smells completely different again. Moldy bread has its own unmistakable scent. If food is simply going bad, why doesn't all bad food smell the same? And here's an even bigger surprise. The food that smells the worst isn't always the food that's most dangerous. So what's actually happening inside your refrigerator? Let's find out. The first thing to know is that food doesn't really go bad in just one way. Sometimes microbes are responsible. Bacteria, yeasts, and molds feeding on your food. Other times, the food begins breaking itself down through its own enzymes or through simple chemical reactions, with no microbes required at all. Either way, something important is happening. As food breaks down, new molecules are being produced. Acids, alcohols, sulfur compounds, amines, and hundreds of other chemicals. Those molecules drift into the air, and your nose detects them. Every spoiled smell is really a chemical fingerprint, telling the story of what's happening inside the food. Let's follow a few of those stories, beginning with one you've almost certainly encountered before. Sour milk. Milk contains a sugar called lactose, and certain bacteria, known as lactic acid bacteria, love it. As they feed, they convert lactose into lactic acid. That acid gives spoiled milk its familiar sour smell and taste. As the acidity rises, it can also change the milk proteins, causing them to clump together. That's why old milk can become lumpy instead of smooth. Here's the interesting part. This is almost exactly the same process used to make yogurt and many cheeses. The chemistry is remarkably similar. The difference is simply whether we wanted it to happen. Now compare that with meat. Here, different bacteria are doing a different kind of work. Instead of feeding mainly on sugars, they're breaking down proteins. That releases an entirely different collection of chemicals: amines, ammonia, and sulfur-containing compounds, which are responsible for that unmistakable rotting smell. Fish has another twist. Many marine fish naturally contain a compound that spoilage bacteria convert into trimethylamine, the molecule responsible for that familiar fishy smell. As more of it is produced, the smell becomes stronger. Now let's look at something that surprises a lot of people. Old cooking oil, stale nuts, forgotten bags of chips. These often develop a sharp, unpleasant flavor, but bacteria aren't the main reason. Instead, oxygen in the air slowly reacts with the fat molecules themselves in a process called lipid oxidation. These changes can happen even without much microbial growth. In this case, oxygen and time are enough to slowly change the chemistry of the food. It's a good reminder that food doesn't always need living organisms to begin changing. Sometimes chemistry works perfectly well on its own. Then there's the image most of us picture first when we think of spoiled food: fuzzy mold. What looks like a soft layer sitting on top of your bread is actually only part of the organism. The visible fuzz is made of tiny thread-like structures called hyphae. But many of those threads have already grown down into the food itself. That's why simply cutting away the visible mold isn't always reliable for softer foods. The organism often extends much farther than your eyes can see. Once again, your senses reveal only part of the story. Now step back for a moment. Notice the pattern. Milk becomes sour because sugars are transformed into acids. Meat develops its characteristic smell because proteins are broken down into amines and sulfur compounds. Oils become rancid because fats react with oxygen. Bread becomes moldy because fungi spread through it. Every smell you've ever associated with spoiled food is really a different chemical signature, a clue to the particular process taking place inside that food. You're not just smelling something bad, you're smelling chemistry. But here's the twist. All of those smells we've just talked about are incredibly useful because they tell us that food has changed. What they don't necessarily tell us is whether that food is dangerous. The microbes responsible for spoilage are often completely different from the ones that cause food poisoning. Some spoiled food is mainly a quality problem. It smells terrible, it tastes terrible, and certainly isn't appetizing, but it may not be especially hazardous. In other words, the strongest smells are often produced by microbes that are simply breaking food down, not necessarily by the ones most likely to make us ill. Meanwhile, some dangerous food can look perfectly normal, smell perfectly normal, and taste perfectly normal. One reason is that some bacteria can produce toxins while growing in food. Imagine a dish that was cooked, but then sat out for too long before you reheated it. During that time, bacteria can quietly multiply and, in some cases, leave toxins behind in the food. Here's the important part. Reheating can kill the bacteria themselves, but some toxins are much more heat stable and may remain even after the bacteria are gone. That's why food safety isn't only about cooking food properly. It's also about limiting how long food spends sitting at temperatures where bacteria can multiply. Your refrigerator helps enormously. It slows both spoilage and the growth of many harmful bacteria, but it doesn't stop these processes completely. It simply slows the invisible changes already underway. So why do we rely so heavily on smell and sight in the first place? Because for most of human history, they worked remarkably well. The smell of sour milk, the odor of rotting meat, or the sight of visible mold were reliable signs that food had been breaking down for some time. Evolution never needed to detect every specific pathogen. It only needed to flag the general signs of decay that were likely to be dangerous. Which means our senses are remarkably good at what they evolved to do. They're just not perfect. The next time you open your refrigerator and wonder if something's still good, remember this. That sour smell, that fishy odor, that patch of mold on forgotten bread, they're not random signs that food has gone bad. They're clues. Evidence of invisible chemistry and microbiology that's been unfolding the entire time. Your kitchen has been telling you the story all along. You just couldn't see it. This is the invisible science of everyday life.